You're listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast, weaving stories told by wonderful minds about all things motherhood, health, intimacy, politics, nature, and everything in between.
Join us on an adventure discovering unique experiences that we can learn from to enhance the ways in which we live.
We are your hosts, Chloe
and Keshia. Welcome everyone to the Road to Wisdom podcast. Today we have Dr. Stu Fischbein in the studio, or not quite in the studio. Unfortunately, we were going to have him in studio and then life happens. So we've got you remotely. Still good. We're very excited for this conversation, Dr. Stu. Dr. Stu has a podcast, Birthing Instincts, and some of you will be shocked to know is an obstetrician who, and maybe one of the only obstetricians we'd ever speak to on the show. We've invited Dr. Stu on for the reason that he is very aligned with a lot of the values that we hold. And so we're really looking forward to today's conversation. Yep.
Is that my cue?
Yeah.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on. I'm sorry I missed you when I was there. I'm back in my little office here in my home, my homestead in southern Utah. Very happy to be back home. Yeah, it's a very sad statement that obstetricians don't come on podcasts like this because it would be really nice to have just a common conversation about why they support the system that they support, and ask them questions. My feeling is that people who are confident in their position are willing to admit they don't know stuff, and they're willing to be open and have a discussion. And people that are, not so confident will often hide behind the authoritative gaze that they have, which is that I'm a doctor and I know best. And I used to feel that way. I mean, I never thought about it that way, but that's the way when I first finished my training, that's how I came out, was being an authoritative doctor, thinking I knew everything. But that slowly changed over the years.
Well, I'd love to know, because your approach is very unique, and it's not every day that obstetricians have the same perspective as you or anywhere near you. And so I'd love to hear just kind of how that came to be from medical school, because we all know that usually people who go to medical school or go to certain institutions become a product of that institution, whereas you did not, obviously.
Or at least you found your way.
You dug out of it in a way.
I did. So I'll give you the abbreviated version because I could talk about this for 15 or 20 minutes. But I trained in a conventional residency program in the early 1980s. And I went, the program was at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, which is a very fine hospital, as hospitals go. And they had a very good program in the early 80s, where they were affiliated with a large hospital called University of Southern California Women's Hospital, or LA County Hospital. And I spent a lot of time there. But before I do that, I have to say a couple of things. It's very difficult to predict how your life will turn out. And there are moments that are obvious, and there are moments that are very subtle that direct you in different ways. And if I hadn't had the personality that I had to challenge people and ask questions, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And if I hadn't found my way to being a resident at Cedars-Sinai through pure chance, then I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And if I hadn't been approached by midwives early in my career for the wrong reasons, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So let me explain. So when I was training as a resident, obviously everything was very medicalized, and it was a different era in 1982 than it is in 2024. But our affiliation with LA County USC was great because it was the busiest hospital in the United States at the time. They were doing about 22,000 births a year there, so people can break that down, and it's about 65 babies a day. And I was there for 4 months, and every other day, so that's 60 days, 65 babies a day. You can do the math. And you can find out that, if 3 to 4% of all babies are breech, then I'm seeing 2 or 3 breaches a day that I'm there. And if 1 in every 3 or 4, 3 to 4% of all, 3%, 2% are twins, then I'm seeing 1 or 2 sets of twins every time I'm there. So I got very well trained in those things, and they were just considered variations of normal. They were just considered something that was part of being an obstetrician. As a matter of fact, we enjoyed doing them. We used to actually fight over who'd get the lady in room 6 with the breech baby, and because it was just something we liked to do, and it was fun. So it was never considered something scary, but in 1982. And then over the next 20 years or so, breech and twins sort of became, for whatever reason, became something that was taught to be dangerous and switched from being a vaginal delivery to a cesarean delivery. But that's another story. What happened to me was I finished my residency in 1986. And in those days, you didn't come out and get a job working for a government or a big health organization and get a salary and work a shift and have a boss. You built your own practice from scratch. And one of the things I did to build my practice from scratch was I hustled. I covered other people when they were on vacation. I assisted them in surgery. I covered free clinics. And I was approached early in my career by some local midwives and asked to take their home birth transports. And as I said earlier, that was very fortuitous for me, but not because I thought it was a good idea. I'm pretty sure that coming out of residency, I probably thought it was foolish to be having home birthing. But I was looking for ways to make money. So I did it because I was a mercenary. And slowly but surely over that time, I began to see another way of doing things. And I began to spend time with the women that were transferred in from home. And most of them were not transferred for anything emergent. They were just transferred because they were tired and they just needed an epidural and some Pitocin. And most of them went on to deliver vaginally. And I got to spend a lot of time with the midwives who came in with them in those days and spent the time with them in the hospital. And I began to hear another way of doing things. And I was open to it, partly because I wasn't that busy. And I was just building my practice. And so over the next 10 years, I became very familiar with the midwifery community in my community. And I started a collaborative hospital-based practice at another hospital north of Los Angeles, because Cedars-Sinai at that time did not allow midwives to have privileges. And the two midwives and I had a collaborative practice, and we had great results. It was a great way to practice. The midwives took care of all the normal stuff, whether it was GYN or OB, and I did all the complicated stuff. So if a woman had an ectopic pregnancy, I would do surgery. If a woman needed a pap smear, the midwives would do that. If a woman had a normal vaginal delivery, the midwives would do that. If the woman needed a C-section or forceps or had a breech or was in preterm labor or something like that, then I would take care of that. And, overall, we had a 7% C-section rate when everyone else in the community had mid to high 20s, which was normal in those days. Now it's up in the mid 30s.
I think it's edging on 40 where we are.
Yeah, well, 40 now, and 70 and 80% in some other countries. But why were we so different? Because of the model by which we practiced, and the fact that we did not look at birth as an illness or a disease. We looked at it as a normal function that occasionally goes awry, and that's where the obstetrician steps in. But for the most part, women are healthy and don't need an obstetrician, yet obstetricians are taking care of, in my country, 92, 93% of births are with OBs. Your country, it's probably a little less, but only like 1% of your country are having home births. And it's a little over 1% in my country. And so the problems in the health of our obstetrical system is not because 1% of women are having births at home. And yet you'd think it was, because that's where all the attention is focused. So so after about 15 years of doing that, the community was never really warm and receptive to our style of practice. And actually, we made the anesthesiologists and the pediatricians more nervous than anything, because they had been indoctrinated by the local OBs to believe that everything we were doing was dangerous, because the OBs didn't like what we were doing. And so they put a lot of pressure on us. And eventually they banned VBAC, they banned the midwives, they banned breech delivery. And I had a choice of fighting them in an administrative hearing process or leaving. So I made a wise choice with a lot of wise advisors, and I left after 24 years of practicing and 4 years after basically 28 years in the hospital. I left to do home birthing. And as I started doing home birthing, I got, the very first time I went to a home birth, I was a little nervous, I'll be honest. After 28 years of backing midwives, I had never been to a home birth, which is typical of most OBs. And but then I got bolder, and after 6 months or a year of doing home births, I said, well, why can't I do breeches at home? Why can't I do twins at home? Why can't I do hypertensives and diabetics at home? Why do they have to have this medicalized birth? And so I began to do all those things. And when you are comfortable and confident in normal, then you can recognize things that go abnormal very quickly. And we had a good transfer system. I had doctors that I knew that I could transfer to, and so we gave women the option. And eventually, after 40 years of delivering babies and being a resident and all that stuff, I got tired of being on call, and so I slowed down and I stopped doing that. And now I go around and I teach breech and twin skills, and I do consults on the internet. And occasionally, I'll go to a birth when I've got a block of time where I can do that. But it's, as you know, all birth workers know, when you have somebody in dates, you can't go anywhere because you never know when that's going to happen. Birth is not a predictable thing. So that's how I got here. So and so I have this unique experience of spending 28 years in the hospital and 12 and a half years in the home. And I know the difference. And I can tell you that the home birth model is a better model for care in every aspect of it. We need the hospital for those women that need it, but that's maybe 10% of women.
Well, let's
The
go.
other 90% don't need all the interventions that they're getting.
Maybe we should go there. What, in your opinion, is categorized or should be categorized as a real risk, as opposed to what we're seeing now? We're seeing everything put in the basket of high risk. Like, you had a 4th degree tear, you got to have a C-section. You have diabetes, you got to be...
Not even as far as going into C-section. Like, so many women would want home births and plan for home births. And I mean, I know people personally who get high risked out of like the midwifery group program here that does home birthing. They'll get high risked out at like 38 weeks, and they're like, oh no, now you have to go and birth in, and it's like the proteins in your urine were too high, or there are things like the high risks now.
It seems easy to be high risk.
Yeah, everyone is high risk. So I guess one of the things we'd love to nut out is what is actually high risk opposed to what everyone is being labeled as at the moment.
Okay, well, there is no definition of high risk.
Good to know.
High risk doesn't have a definition. Okay. The definition is that something untoward is more likely to happen than usual, or somebody's more likely to be, a baby or mother's more likely to be injured than usual. Mm-hmm. Problem, of course, is what does usual mean? And nobody knows. So ultimately, high risk is not a number. And I can give really good examples of that. High risk is what makes a doctor uncomfortable. And doctors will do a lot of things that are riskier than the things they consider high risk, and they won't consider them high risk. And I can give you a couple examples of that if you want.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay. So hang on a second. I'm just going to pull this up. So doctors, you're labeled high risk when your doctor becomes uncomfortable. And then by labeling a woman high risk, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now you've made that woman nervous. And now she believes she's high risk. And that creates anxiety. And what effect does that have? So what happens is that doctors will downplay certain risks, like, cesarean section is not a risk to doctors. Repetitive unnecessary ultrasounds is not a risk to doctors. Well, they'll upcode other risks, like being over 35 years old or breech. But I would ask you guys, this is a rhetorical question, which carries more risk? Being 35 years old or having a cesarean section?
Probably
having well-controlled diabetes or undergoing an induction of labor.
Yeah.
We live in a world right now where they tell your kids it's okay to have processed food and eat candy and soda, but if they have raw milk, that's unhealthy.
You're my new favorite person.
What's
I
that?
think our whole
You're my
audience,
new favorite person.
our whole audience just fell in love with you.
Yeah. Well, this is the absurdity of high risk is whatever a doctor is uncomfortable with. And let's see, I think I wrote something else down here. Hang on a second, I'll pull it up. simply, maybe to many of my medically leaning colleagues, high risk is simply the unpredictability of nature's risks that create fear and discomfort in them. And they differentiate it from the risk that they prefer, the risk that they often instigate, and the risk that they find acceptable. And it's not really a number. And the problem is that they'll often say something is high risk when actually it's just a higher chance. And a higher chance of something does not mean it's high risk. They're not the same thing. When they're counseling, they'll often use the term relative, they'll say relative risk, like it's 3 times riskier. But for those listening, that means nothing unless you know what the denominator is. For instance, if something happens 1 in a million times and now it's 3 times riskier, it's still 1 in 333,333. That's still 0. Okay, or as close to 0 as you can get. So, yeah, so when they will say anything is high risk, I know that because I spent time in Australia, I know that with the coming of potentially the new rules next year, that if a woman was hypertensive in a previous pregnancy, she can't qualify for a home birth in a subsequent pregnancy, even if she's normotensive. If she was labeled with she failed her diabetes screening in a previous pregnancy, now she'll forever be labeled as a potential high risk mom. And again, when you label a woman high risk, you plant seeds of doubt in them and you change the whole chemistry of the pregnancy. Right. So what do I mean by that? It's a very simple thing. There's a movie I talk about all the time called Inception. Maybe you saw it. It's directed by Christopher Nolan. And they're trying to plant an idea in the head of the character played by an actor named Cillian Murphy, I think. And one of the guys says, well, why can't we just tell him? And he says, well, he'll know where it came from. And then they say, well, what do you mean? And they say, well, don't think about elephants. So now that I said, don't think about elephants, what are you thinking about?
Of course.
Elephants. Right. So if I tell you at your 10-week visit that, you're over 35, so there's a possibility that your placenta could give out and the rate of stillbirth is higher and diabetes is higher. So we're going to start testing you a little earlier. What have I just done to you?
Yeah. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Or maybe even not, but most likely not, because that's not likely to happen. By the way, the age 35 thing is bullshit.
Yes.
If I can say that on your podcast.
You
I guess
can.
it's a podcast, so I can say whatever I want. Yeah, that's a stupid number. I mean, to tell me that you're fine at 34 years and 11 months and then you have a birthday and now you're high risk. Right. That's insane. And I could go off into a tangent about age 35, but I won't. I'm just going to say that you asked the question about what is high risk. So high risk is, again, what you're not comfortable with. And doctors, unfortunately, are not comfortable with just about everything related to pregnancy. And that's partly, it's cultural and it's indoctrination, and it's medical legal, and it's expediency, and it's economics. Doctors have to make a living. And even if they're on salary, sometimes their salary is based on what their productivity. And the more a doctor does, the more a doctor makes. There's no money in not doing something. So when you declare somebody high risk, you now get to see them more often. You do more scans and more tests on them. And in a for-profit system, you make more money. But even in a system like yours, where the government pays for it, the hospital bills for things, the hospital makes more money the more it does.
Yeah.
So all the incentives are backwards. And and then the only reason to not consider somebody high risk is to satisfy the need of the client. And that's not the motivation of the medicalized birth system. Medicalized birth system isn't about the individual woman.
Yeah, well, this is something
And
I actually wanted
your listeners
to...
all know this. You guys know this.
Yeah.
I wanted to actually bring that up is usually, and I've found this personally, and I know many, many women have, is when a woman who's pregnant goes to an obstetrician or a midwife that's more on the medicalized side, and you present yourself with an informed type of attitude, you are almost always met with frustration, and you're labeled difficult, and
Bit of gaslighting thrown in
yeah,
there.
and I struggle with that, and a lot of people do, and it builds this, like, you know, resentment towards the whole entire system. And I know a lot of people struggle with that, and I just wonder, like, what is the motivation? What is the reason for that in your opinion?
Because they're insecure, they're uncomfortable being challenged. They look at which is more risky: a woman who challenges her obstetrician, or a woman who follows every recommendation her obstetrician makes. Which women are going to have better outcomes or worse outcomes? It's obvious to me that the woman that follows every guideline or every recommendation her doctor makes is more likely to have worse outcomes. Yet the doctor will consider the woman who's asking him questions all the time to be more high risk.
It's interesting because
it's human psychology.
Yeah. And often we do see the situation where women have gone down the path of OB care or whatever their thing, and they've ended up in a C-section. And I've briefly heard you touch on this, but I'd like to go into it more, is that a woman will end up taking herself to triage or emergency, or like about to give birth. And she's walked into this model of care, and she has a perfectly healthy, normal situation going on, and then she walks into that model of care, and then the baby, who's full term, otherwise healthy, ends up in NICU. And the whole attitude towards that, and all the lens that everyone's looking through, is we saved that baby. That woman was, saved by us. We were needed, and how good are we? And pat on the backs. And I'm sorry that your baby's ended up in NICU, but thank God you were here.
Sometimes that woman will then also jump on board that train.
Yes,
and even though she's feeling probably deep seeds of trauma, she's like, oh, but they had to. And
they saved me.
That story as well.
I'd love to go. Yeah. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the system is set up, again, to consider, it looks at pregnancy as a high-risk condition. So when you come in there, they're already geared up for that. And if a woman, like I do say that all the time, because all you have to do, guys, is look at outcomes. You just have to look at the outcomes, all right? With all the interventions and all the technology and all the testing that's being done now, and all the extra ultrasounds, and now the color flow Doppler and the changing of the definition of growth restriction to be 10% of babies now are growth restricted according to the MFM. When you do all that, how come the outcomes aren't better? I like to talk about movies all the time, and maybe in your country people don't watch a movie called Moneyball with Brad Pitt, but it's a really good movie. And he plays a general manager of a baseball team, and he's talking to his scouts, and his scouts say that there's this really good hitter in the minor leagues, and we should take a good look at him. And the guy he's playing, his name is Billy Bean, and he says to the scout, well, if he's such a good hitter, how come he doesn't hit good? And if the medicalized system is so good, how come it's not so good? How come we've gone from a C-section rate of 5% 50 years ago? Now, you could, a lot of people will make the mistake, it's not a mistake, it's a purposeful deception of comparing birth now to 100 years ago. But 100 years ago, we didn't have germ theory. We didn't have antibiotics. We didn't have a lot of stuff. We didn't know a lot of stuff. But let's look at birth now compared to 50 years ago, 1974. 1974, the C-section rate was, in your country, 5-6%. All right? The neonatal death rate and the maternal death rate, all right, were either the same as they are now or slightly better. All right. The diagnoses of fetal distress, fetal intolerance to labor, those things obviously were far less because you only had a 5% C-section rate. So what happened in 50 years? And are our outcomes better despite all this intervention? And the answer is an easy one, if you're willing to look at it. The problem is, if you're indoctrinated into a system, you have this thing called cognitive dissonance and mass formation. And it's very difficult to look at something and say, I've been doing it wrong for 20 years. And you mentioned that a woman, sometimes she believes that she had to have all these things done. Part of it is because she trusted her physician, and part of it is because the alternative to think that I let these things be done to me and they were done unnecessarily is very difficult for someone to look at. And this is not sitting in judgment of anybody. And also you hear stories about, I had to have an emergency C-section. And it's like, well, how many emergency C-sections do we really have to do? Because there's a lot of them out there. You hear about a lot of emergency C-sections. All right. Well, we don't have a lot of emergency C-sections at home birth. We rarely have an emergency at home. The emergencies happen because of the cascade of interventions that you sort of alluded to earlier, when a woman walks in with a perfectly healthy baby inside her belly, and somehow that baby ends up in the NICU. But that whole cascade of interventions is something that is it's all iatrogenic. It's not something that necessarily needs to happen. And here's the funny thing about emergency C-sections. If you ask a woman who says she had an emergency C-section, so when they decided that you needed a C-section, how fast did they have you on the operating room table? And they'll say 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Tell you right off the top, that's not an emergency C-section. All right. Yet, the woman believes that because that's what she was told. It might have been urgent, but it was generally probably through a cascade of interventions. Now, that's, again, we always put this caveat in. That's not to say that sometimes things go awry. Bad things happen in pregnancy, but nature's design is perfect. And every time we meddle with Mother Nature, there are going to be downstream consequences. And every time we meddle with Mother Nature, we better be damn sure that the intervention that we're putting in place is safe and effective, as opposed to just trying it and then seeing what happens with no concern for downstream consequences. And this is a big issue for me, because I read a lot of papers, and I read a lot of guidelines put out by ACOG and RANSCOG and stuff like that. And what we see when we look at those papers is there's only two endpoints that matter. And that's neonatal death and neonatal morbidity, and occasionally C-section rate. All right. And those are things obviously very important. But in the process of trying to lower neonatal death and neonatal morbidity, when they're not being successful, they ought to take a look at themselves. And it's not the only thing that matters. What else matters is, how's that baby's microbiome? How's that baby's immune system? How's that baby doing at age 5? How's that mother? How's that mother's bonding? How is her breastfeeding? How's her emotional support? Does that mother have postpartum depression? Does the mother feel traumatized? How did that mother do in subsequent pregnancies when she had that unnecessary C-section? Oh, did she have a placenta accreta and then lose her uterus in a subsequent pregnancy? Those things are never endpoints. They never look at that stuff. But why would they? Because their mission is to keep the status quo. Don't ask me why, because that's a head trip to try to figure out why doctors continue to support a system that has rising interventions with no obvious benefit and pretty obvious detriment.
I briefly skimmed a study. It was the massive cohort of like 500,000 women, and I think they were tracked for like 8 years or something. And it was very, very, very evident. We could not argue it, that all these mothers who had these intervention births, whether it was forceps, C-section, like inductions, whatever, their children were clearly affected. Whether it was like, I think majority of those women who had C-sections, their children had metabolic dysfunctions. They weren't thriving. And of course, that's going to be harder and harder to differentiate now, because so many babies are born like that, and plus a whole other host of things happening in our environment. But yeah, it just blows my mind that we can't look at that. Like, that's just not 50 people. That's 500,000 people over an almost 10-year period. Why are we not using this as like, okay, let's pivot. This isn't working. it's not helping women.
Well, to further that, there was I'm pretty sure it was a Cochrane review that looked across home births, birth centre births, and hospital births. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before. And what they found in that was that baby outcomes were the same across all three categories. But what they were seeing play out, and this didn't follow babies' outcomes past, I think, neonatal. But yeah, the outcomes for women were like infinitely worse, where if you were like a home birth versus a hospital birth, and then obviously birth centres like kind of dead in the centre, yeah, you'd see like the intervention rates in women being cut open, whether that's an episiotomy or a C-section, being, yeah, just, I guess, more manhandled versus a home birth was like chalk and cheese. But then, yeah, the outcomes for babies were the same across all categories. So I found that really interesting. And when you see that, like you said, when you see that the outcomes for mothers and children hasn't changed, even though intervention rates have skyrocketed, I don't understand why we can't reanalyze what is happening, because I guess something that we've seen a lot of, and we listen to a lot of free birth stories here, we've seen there's a massive movement towards free birth, because when you talk about the hospital system and people's experiences within the hospital system have been like torturous, to say the least. But then when they look back at the statistics and they're like, oh, my child's outcome most likely would have been the same. Most likely, like obviously there are going to be, a caveat there. But yeah, it's like pushing women further and further away from this hospital system that we see in our area anyway. Because they can't get the care that they would want or need within that system. So, yeah, it's interesting that we do have a lot of research now out there that is showing that what is happening in hospitals isn't really working.
Yeah, but Keshia, it'll just be ignored. And there's reasons it'll be ignored because the system isn't about getting better results. The system is about being financially solvent or profiteering or making money. That's what it's about. Because if you were running a company, a private company, and your outcomes were getting worse, the more you did and the more you spent money, you change course. You probably would fire your chief financial officer, and you'd probably fire most of your administrators, and you'd start over again. But that's not what happens. So a couple things that you said there that I was thinking about while you said it. Obviously, if the motivation was to get the best outcomes for the individual woman, then we might see some changes being made. But again, I'm going to reiterate that that's not what the system's about. And it's not that the individual nurse or doctor or midwife that's in the system doesn't want the best outcome for the woman they're caring for at that moment. But there's a couple problems with that. They're just cogs in the wheel now. They're just employees. And they have to keep their head down because they have to keep their job. Just like you saw with COVID, people just went along with it to keep their job. So if they don't keep their head down, they're going to potentially get fired or lose their job. So they're just cogs in the wheel. One of the worst things that ever happened in medicine, in my opinion, was when doctors became employees of health systems. Because my fiduciary duty as an independent physician, and I've been fortunate my whole career to, I have to get privileges at a hospital, and I'm licensed by the state of California at that when I was practicing in California, and I had to do all that. But I never had a boss telling me how to practice, what I could prescribe, what surgeries I could do and what I couldn't do, whether I couldn't let people go past 41 weeks, whether I had to induce all my diabetics at 38 weeks. I didn't have anybody telling me that, so I could do things independently. When doctors became employees, now their fiduciary duty is conflicted. And now they're, even though their loyalty should be to the patient they're taking care of, they also have to keep their job. And so that's a real problem. So money is the driving force behind all of it. And you can see that in every aspect of our lives. It's not just healthcare, it's in every aspect of our life. Secondly, you mentioned something about this very large study, right? And yeah, there are studies that are going to come out that are going to say one thing, and there are studies that are going to come out and say another thing. And most people don't even know how to read a study. And so most people don't read studies. What they do is they read the headline in a newspaper, or they read the abstract, and then they go right to the conclusions, and they skip the material and methods and results section, which can really tell you whether this is a good study or not. Because a study may conclude something that sounds contrary to common sense, but if it's a study, it must be right, right? And then you read the information, and you find out there were only 12 people in the study, and they had no controls over who was doing what or whatever, and you can find out it's not a very good study. But if it supports the way the system wants to work, there'll be confirmation bias on that, and it will be promoted. Whereas your 500,000 person study, which showed in all aspects better outcomes for mothers when you compared apples to apples, which means low risk women with singleton pregnancies, they had less interventions, less episiotomies, less trauma, less emotional trauma, better outcomes, all that stuff. With better bonding rates, better breastfeeding, all that stuff was better in the home setting, mediocre medium in the birth center setting, and then worse in the hospital setting. But here's the deal: did we really need a study to tell us that?
No.
This is the
like
thing.
All things.
This is the thing. People, they want to do a study, and when the study doesn't prove what they want, they ignore it anyway. But I don't need a study to tell me that it's safer to cross the street when the light is green than when it's red. Yet you'll have an academician who'll tell you, well, how do you know? How do you know? Well, some things you just know.
I know. It is nice having the study though, isn't it? Because there are people who are like study. Like I need the studies.
Yes, but the problem is that things that should be studied won't be studied, because who runs the studies?
Pharmaceutical
Academia.
companies.
And the pharmaceutical companies, because they support the journals.
Yeah.
So the studies that need to be run, like when you look at the vaccine industry, why didn't the FDA in my country, FDA or the CDC, ever run a study that looked at children who followed the vaccine schedule, their health compared to children who got no vaccines? That would be the ideal study to do. They never did it. They just told you vaccines were safe. Finally, now they've proven that that's not the case. We knew that. Those of us that just did any reading knew that a long time ago. And it's the same thing here. When you look at the outcomes of how we're doing with children, babies, and chronic diseases, yes, you mentioned earlier, it's multifactorial. I mean, we have shitty food. We have shitty air and water. We're putting chemicals in the water. We're injecting our kids with heavy metals. We're spraying chemtrails in the ozone. We've got 5G everywhere. People have Alexa in their baby's room. You got to be out of your mind to have, you're exposed. So, and our kids are unhealthy. When you have the unhealthiest generation of children we've ever had. I mean, children weren't this unhealthy 100 years ago, but they don't talk about that 100 years ago. There are diseases now that children have that didn't exist 100 years ago. Crohn's disease didn't exist. SIDS didn't exist. Those things didn't exist. Don't we want to know why? No, they're not going to look, because they don't want to know why.
Just don't put a pillow
the system
in
is,
their
as
thing.
people always say, the system is working perfectly well for those that run the system right now. So why would they want to look at something that's going to make them look bad? They're not going to do that. But I just would challenge anybody listening to just consider look at the outcomes 50 years ago to now. ADHD didn't exist 70 years ago. Kids were hyperactive. What did we tell them to do? Go outside. Go play. Come back when it's dark. That's what we told them.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah, well, I was a hyperactive kid.
Yeah.
And, my parents just told me to go outside.
Yeah. That's what we're trying to bring back.
Don't come back till dinner time.
When it's dark or when the street lights come on, you may come home.
Yeah.
But it's interesting though, because like you've covered so much, but something that I always think about is, obviously the big thing that you just mentioned was that like these things didn't exist 80 to 100 years ago. And I guess obstetrics and hospital making birth medicalized is only really 100 years old. And so there's definitely like an obvious timeline, you know, like you can look at it and be like, well, what's happened here? But also, I also know it just seems like such a sticky situation, and maybe as someone who's been on both sides, there's actually a lot of midwives and a lot of doulas and a lot of birth workers who follow us and listen to our podcast. And what I always hear is like there is so much red tape in birth in hospitals, and there actually are midwives who want to operate in certain ways and they literally can't because they have paperwork. They have like, if they do this, then they're going to lose their registration or they're going to lose their ability to work. So they just do it anyway, or they just give up, or they're just like, oh, whatever, or like it's all complicated and whatnot. And I also know that some of the bigger institutions in Australia actually teach things to students like breech birth and how to do things, but it doesn't transfer into the actual hospital's
Practice.
into the practice and model of care. And I guess my point is like, if you're a midwife or if you're a birth worker or you're an aspiring midwife who particularly loves physiological birth, or you're
women,
like what is there to do?
Yeah, like what would your recommendations be for those who are trying to practice in a way that is beneficial for mother and child, but because of the red tape, they've had to either move out of the system and now they're not registered, or like they're trying to do it within the system but like try and keep their license at the same time? Like what is left? Like what kind of advice do you have for those women? And men. Hey guys, we're jumping on today to share with you some of our favourite mushroom products from Super Feast.
I've been doing some fertility awareness method one-on-one trainings and just talking about some other symptoms that I've been having with this postpartum. And one of them happens to be like mamahood ADHD. I don't know if everybody knows, but it's actually a thing. And so one of the things I'm going to be putting into my routine in the mornings is just a little bit of lion's mane to kind of ground me down and bring me back into my body, close a couple of tabs, and just help with that brain fog, which we all know too well in motherhood.
Yes, well, this postpartum, I have definitely been supporting myself with Jing, which is a kidney tonic, and has replaced coffee for me, believe it or not. It is fantastic, it's delicious, and it's a really nice little ritual still in the morning to have a nice warm drink. If any of you guys are out there and wanting to try these products, jump onto Superfeast. We will put a link in our show notes and use the code ROADTOWISDOM10 to enjoy 10% off.
Amazing.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I get asked this a lot because we'd like to have a quick answer for you and make it make a solution. But you have to be true to yourself, and each person's going to have to make their own decision. If this is your sole means of support and income, then you're going to be in the same dilemma that these doctors are, who work in a system that they know is corrupt, and they're going to do it, and they do it anyway. So you're going to compromise your values and keep your job, or you can compromise your job by keeping your values. And until it gets bad enough, guys, then this will go on. And it's not bad enough yet, because when it's bad enough, the women of your country will begin to stop, as Melanie Jackson likes to say, they'll stop nurturing the giant tree in the forest. And eventually the giant tree's branches will fall off and the tree will die. And what has to happen is that the hospital system needs to understand and needs to suffer both financial and public relations dilemmas, or PR, where their reputations are so bad that they have to make a change. And one of the things that I'm working on right now, it's just starting, but in my country, there's a legal action group which is involved with some friends of mine that fights for what we call Freedom of Information Act stuff, and they sue big companies, and they file class action lawsuits on behalf of people who were injured for something like vaccines, that sort of thing. What we need is a legal defense fund for midwives around the world, so that when they're harassed about their registration, or when they're accused anonymously by somebody because they did something, and you never get to know who your accuser was, and you have to hire an attorney and spend thousands of your own dollars for that. We want to have a legal defense set up so that they can call, and we can send in a team of well-versed lawyers to go after the people that went after them and make them uncomfortable. Because until we make them as uncomfortable as they're making us, nothing's going to change. And that may sound like mean or nasty or anything like that, but yeah, but killing with kindness doesn't work. It doesn't work. Nothing's going to change until these people are meant to suffer real personal economic damages. When you go after when a hospital turns a midwife in for doing what she thought was right and for honoring a woman's choices, and they turn her in, the person that turns her in needs to be publicly called out, possibly sued personally.
This is happening a lot.
So that person has to then hire an attorney herself or himself to say, hey, I was just doing my job. The problem is right now they have anonymity, and that system has to change. So we're also going to need some people, and most people who like doing stuff don't want to do this, but some people are going to have to go into politics and administration. Just going to have to do it. And some people are going to go to jail. You know, I just was in Canada speaking at the Reclaiming Birth Conference, and I sat on a panel with Gloria LeMay. Some of you may know who she is. Gloria LeMay went to jail for honoring the choices of the women that she was caring for. And she tells funny stories about being in jail for 2 months. Right.
Legend.
So, you know, she made the best of it. But could she afford it? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, who can afford to go to jail? Most of us would be embarrassed beyond belief to do that. Most of us have families. We can't necessarily go to jail. We can't risk our financial security. But on the other hand, you can't sell yourself out either, because you're gonna lose your soul if you do that.
Stu, I have a question.
I don't think that I answered the question though, because I
okay.
don't
I've
really
got
know
another
that
one.
there is an answer.
Yeah.
I've got another
But
question.
I'm gonna try to do something, because everywhere in the world that I go, the deregistering thing is something I hear about everywhere. People worried about their, not going to jail so much as just losing their ability to make a living. And simply because they did what the client wanted them to do, and what the client which was, in medically speaking, a reasonable choice. Yet because somebody in an administrative position didn't like it, or some OB sitting in judgment of what midwives do didn't like it, they got in trouble. And the truth is, obstetricians should not be judging midwives. Should be the other way around, actually. But midwifery is a separate profession. Midwifery is not a lesser subset of obstetrics. Midwives are experts in normal birthing. Doctors are not. And yet they're the go-to people. I don't know how many of your doctors belong to RANSCOG or ACOG in my country. All right. A lot of them do, because professionally it looks good on their resume. But I'm telling you that RANSCOG does not represent the rank and file obstetrician. In my country, the American Medical Association represents about 14% of doctors. Yet when they speak, the press thinks they're speaking authoritatively for all doctors, when they only represent a small number of doctors, most of whom are in academia and are not practicing physicians. And the same thing goes for things like RANSCOG. RANSCOG represents RANSCOG. And RANSCOG has its own interests, and they're financial. Because if they were for the benefit of the women of your country, then they would do policies that would say, we need to bring breech teaching back in all residency programs. We need to bring twin delivery skills back in all residency programs. We need to look at this C-section rate of 40%, and we need to look at this induction rate of 35% or whatever it is. And this 30% fucking episiotomy rate, because of your perineal bundle thing, whatever that is. Never heard of such a thing. When I was there, they were talking about that. And you have a 30% episiotomy rate. I haven't cut an episiotomy in probably 10 years.
Mm.
And 3 in 10 women are getting episiotomies. I mean, when I was a resident in a medical school in 1981, every single woman got a mediolateral episiotomy because we didn't want them to get a 4th degree. So instead, we cut right into their gluteus muscle because that's so much better. And now it's 50 some years later, and they're bringing it back in your country. These people are out of their mind. And these are obstetricians that are making these decisions, and then they're sitting in judgment of how midwives practice. That's got to stop. It's got to stop.
Stu, do you think, like, we obviously, Keshia's free birthed 4 out of 5 of her babies, and a lot of, like, I've made choice not to have registered midwives at my births, and a lot of our listeners make the same choice, and a lot of us feel like that is the best choice. But do you, as the person that you are and what you know, do you feel like free birth is a positive thing for the future of women and the birthing model that most women are taking? Or what I'm trying to say is, like, do you know what I mean? Like, is it a positive?
Is it a positive movement?
Yeah. I want to talk about I want to just like quickly break apart the risks of it as well, because often we're like, we're labeled as like absolutely reckless, foolish, whatever. But ultimately we're just doing what you're saying women are capable of doing, but without the person looking over our shoulder.
The choice that women are making to free birth, and while there is a subset of women who are doing this because they are just, I want a free birth. That's it. That's the end of the conversation. The majority of women who are moving into free birth have either been traumatized in previous pregnancies, have experienced some form of other kind of trauma in a hospital, are high risked out of having a midwife, which is what they would have preferred, and there's just no way they're going into a hospital. So the option that most women are left with now is just to go it alone. And some women will try and like makeshift midwifery care by hiring a birth keeper or a doula. But that's what we're seeing. And I think a lot of women, not all, but a lot of women are feeling backed into a corner, and that this is their only option. So coming from an obstetrician who's obviously seen the full picture within the hospital and within home birth, when we start talking about free birthing, what are you seeing, and like, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, if you asked me this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have said that I couldn't really support free birthing at all. But now I have a much better understanding, as you said, of why women are choosing to do it. And in an ideal situation, I don't. It's not something I would support. But we don't have an ideal situation right now. And if I were a woman, especially a woman who's what we call a multiparous woman, or one who's already had a vaginal delivery, the success rate of home birth with those women is probably 99%, 98%. So for them, for sure, if their only choice is essentially, being funneled down a path, either through a registered midwife who's got so many limitations upon her, or going to a hospital where they're not going to be able to honor her birth choices, then I would be 100% supportive of free birth. I actually think that what ideal situation would be for a woman, even if she has a midwife, to free birth and have the midwife, be sitting on the front step, or putting some shrimp on the Barbie in the backyard while you're doing that, or something like that. Just having someone with skill around.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that if something were to happen that we needed sort of attention, like a postpartum hemorrhage or something like that, that there'd be somebody there to do that. But when we talked earlier in the podcast about the way the outcomes are in the hospital right now, and in your country, because I saw the stats when I was there, I mean, a woman walking into the hospital right now has a 40% chance of having a C-section. She stays home, she's got about a 4% chance of having a C-section, I suspect, give or take. So same cohort of women. So why would a woman choose to do that? just in case, to err on the side of caution. I mean, it's not cautious to walk into a situation where you take a woman from the place she feels safest, the place she feels most comfortable, surrounded by people that she's invited to her into her environment, into a place where she doesn't feel comfortable, surrounded by strangers who are changing shift every 12 hours. That is not a conducive system to success. So by going to the hospital, you're setting yourself up far more likely to have something go awry than the rare cases where things would go awry at home. You know, neither one of those is ideal. But if I were to have the choice, and that were my only choices, knowing what I know now, I would have to support free birth. And it's coming out of my mouth. It's like still the innate OB inside of me says there's something weird about that.
Yeah.
But the realist inside of me and the person that's observed what's going on in birth understands exactly why it makes perfect sense. I mean, how many horses need well, that's maybe not a great attention because there are race horses there's race horses who, you know, have $1 million horse inside them. So, you know, but how many cats or dogs, you know, need to go to the vet to deliver unless you're a French bulldog? How and I'm not even sure French bulldogs need to have C-sections, but that's what French bulldog owners have been told.
French bulldogs aren't even, I'm going to say this.
They're not even
real dogs. They're literally a genetically modified dog.
It's like GMO. Like
yeah, so how many real dogs
wolves,
or
like
cats,
with wolves.
Literally.
Yeah, need that sort of intervention.
Yeah.
Not very many. How many die in childbirth? I don't know. But we can't be doing much worse than we're doing now. So I perfectly understand it. And I wish it wasn't a Sophie's choice like that. I wish it wasn't one or the other. I wish a woman had all the choices that she wanted. And if she wanted to free birth, but then she may wanted help, that there's somebody she could call to come help her.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that world doesn't exist because the medical world won't allow it to exist.
And, including media, actually. I don't know if you were aware or brought to the attention of recent media in Australia, but there was a journalist who was snooping around for free birth situations with poor outcomes, and she reported on that. And it was a target piece, I guess, against doulas and unregistered birth workers. And basically, I think the goal of it was to be like, see, look at these poor outcomes when women don't go into hospital or have a midwife present. And that was really hard, I guess, to read or even just to absorb, because it was rarely looked at. Well,
it was just an opinion.
It was an opinion, and a lot of not
Did
a lot.
Did you get into the whys of why these women were choosing home birth?
Well,
free birth?
To be honest, the way it was framed was that these women don't know. They don't know any better, and that's why they're free birthing. Like it wasn't
just reckless. It was a target to make free birthers look a little bit reckless, uneducated, and baby murderers, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
What you have to understand is you have to look into the history of the reporter. You have to look into who financed the article. You have to look into, there's a lot of things you look into when it's a propaganda piece like that.
Yeah, and when you've got women looking for alternative ways so to keep them and their baby safe because they believe that not going into hospital is going to be the safest outcome for them and their child, then you've got media coming out like this that is completely destroying any kind of, I guess, the option for these women to explore.
Well, they're big and we're small. And they have the people that run these hospital corporations and things like that. Even when you have a government-run system, the hospital's big business, and they don't if they don't want to lose market share. So, and they also have the money to control the media and the press. So, if somebody should go in and do an undercover story or about what they have, and I've read them about what goes on in the hospital too. And there are hit pieces on the hospital that, again, because of our confirmation bias, we believe that those are true, and we believe this one's a hit piece. Well, they'll believe that this is a true and that's a hit piece. And the analogy that I use for confirmation bias is if you have a big, the letter 6 on the ground, or the number 6 on the ground, and you have one guy standing on this end and one guy standing on that end, one guy's going to say it's a 6, the other guy's going to say it's a 9. And as long as they stay in their own box, it's always going to be a 6 or a 9. If they were to get out of their box and walk around and look at the other side, they might be able to see a whole different way of doing things, but they never get out of their box. And so people that work in the hospital that see a train wreck come in from home, that's their only view of home birth. And people that are trying to do a home birth because they had a train wreck in the hospital the first time, they're going to have their bias too. Hospital does miraculous things sometimes. The problem is that they were doing miraculous things in 1970 when the C-section rate was 5%. And now, and again, the rate of cerebral palsy, the rate of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, the rate of stillbirth has not fallen. If anything, it's risen a little bit. Certainly not commensurate with the rise in interventions. The rise in maternal, in 1970, there was probably no such thing as a maternal fetal medicine specialist.
I didn't even know that existed.
And if there was, they were rarely used as consultants for rare things. Now it's unusual for any woman to get through pregnancy in my country without seeing an MFM at least once, maybe for the 20-week ultrasound, where she has unnecessary testing done like color flow Doppler. Because in my country, you can bill for that. Color flow Doppler started out as a very narrow thing to look for babies that had growth restriction, to look and see if there was predictive about whether or not you could predict whether they were going to demise or not. And now I don't think an MFM turns on his machine without turning on the color flow Doppler. With no concern, by the way, the fact that this is a higher level of non-ionizing radiation. And they're turning it on at a 9-week ultrasound. Why? Why? Well, because there's a code that they can bill for it and they get more money for it. Because there's no other reason to do it. It doesn't change the outcomes except in very rare occasions. And then those things are usually found clinically anyway. And then they can go and look. But to screen every single woman for these sorts of problems just creates more problems. And more fear and more anxiety. And by the way, as we talked about at the very beginning, fear and anxiety that's created by calling someone high risk is the best way you can motivate somebody, because you can manipulate anybody when you start to scare them. Because fear is the strongest emotion. It's stronger than love. It's stronger than hate. It's the strongest motivating emotion that we have. And a woman would do anything to save her baby. So when a doctor uses language like, if we don't do this, your baby could die, what we lovingly call the dead baby card, what's a woman going to do who doesn't know any better? And even if she does, she's going to still feel a little bit weak-kneed.
We see this a lot.
Well, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm being wrong.
We've experienced, I've personally experienced it a number of times.
Yeah, so. And a lot of our guests have also, shared their story of whoever was there present giving them the death baby card, and it's freaking horrible. And I, as empowered as we may even think we are, I've been in a position where I have had to second guess, or I felt quite vulnerable, and it kind of all goes out the window. But I did have a question before that leaves me. I want to kind of change the lens on this a little bit just towards the end. Is something that we're big on is really looking at ourselves when it comes to our own suffering as women. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on what our role is as women who are birthing and coming to professionals like midwives, birth workers, OBs, whatever you want to call it. Where are we creating our own suffering in all of this?
Well, far be it from me as a male to even touch this question. I mean, I touch it with reverence and respect because, I think that the whole process is awesome and what women go through. When I watch, I still shed tears when I watch birth videos that I've seen 100 times. So, because I'm just a birth geek like the rest of you guys. How are they? The question was, how are they contributing to it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of us like blindly just walk into it being like, like I trust somebody else as opposed to I trust myself.
Well,
I'm going to just birth my baby. It's just that simple. We're often very, very quick to pass the responsibility onto an OB, a midwife. They're going to take care of me. They're going to do all this for me. They're going to take away any responsibility or any problems that may arise.
I feel like you are like women unknowingly.
They unknowingly
enter
do
that
it. So
situation,
it's always nice to just turn the mirror back on women and be like, what are we doing here?
Women are they're culturally conditioned to believe that that's the case, and that's got to change. All right, and I think it is changing. On an optimistic point of view, I think the reason we're having discussions like this and stuff is because there is an awakening. And, we're being gaslit and the women know it and they're figuring it out. So what can a woman do? Well, a woman can figure this out when, what we need to do is we need to reach girls when they're teenagers in schools. We need to teach this sort of stuff in schools and not some of the other crap they're teaching in schools these days. And to learn to ask questions. I mean, to understand how the body works, to understand the power that and awesomeness of this whole process, and how it shouldn't be mysterious to women. It shouldn't be something they handed off. I mean, it is funny that they'll hand this off to somebody, a third party, but they'll spend days looking at tattoos to figure out which tattoo they want to get on the big toe of their left foot. All right. They'll put more research into the tattoo on their toe than they do how the process of childbearing and childbirth and getting pregnant and the menstrual cycle and the miracle of it all works. I mean, we use this analogy all the time. You guys have heard it now because it's become universal, but the two most important events in a woman's life, generally speaking, are the birth of her children and her wedding day. And it's conventional. I'm not just take this as an example. Okay. And for your wedding, you plan everything. You plan the menu list. You plan who you're inviting. You pick the invitations. You pick the color of the napkins, for God's sakes. You pick the cake. You pick everything. You pick the venue. You pick who's going to be your presiding over your marriage. And you plan this for months and months and months and months, and you dream about it for a big part of your life. And for your birth, basically, you say, "Oh, I got my public insurance card. I'll just go to the guy that's been doing my Pap smear for 10 years, and I'll just do that, and I'll abdicate all responsibility to that." So we came up with this analogy that's like, well, what if they had free weddings or wedding insurance? And what if when you were getting married, your wedding was paid for by the government, but you didn't get to pick the food, and you didn't get to pick the venue, and you didn't get to pick the color of the goddamn napkins, okay? And they invited people to your wedding you didn't like, and they picked a day you didn't want to have it on. Who would do that? You would never do that. Yet for your birth, you just abdicate responsibility because, and by the way, for your wedding, you spend thousands of dollars on that.
Yeah.
For your birth, you want it to be covered by your government insurance. Why? Why not start saving money when you're 20 years old and putting it away for the birth that you want, so that you can hire the private midwife that you want, or you can hire the private obstetrician that you want, or you can travel to another country where you can get the kind of birth that you want.
It's a great point.
Yeah.
I've never really thought about that before.
Put some planning into it, because it is 50% of weddings end in divorce. But you have your kids you're going to have.
You're touching
your kids
some
you're going
good
to have
topics, yeah.
for your whole life, and the last thing you'll think about when you're on your deathbed, most likely, will be your children. So why not make those memories really good? Why not try to have some say in those memories? Because I will tell you, Every woman loves her babies, but not every woman loves the experience she had of having her babies. Far too many don't. And that's really tragic. And that's partly because we abdicate that responsibility to people who really don't care about us. We think that they do, but they don't. You're not in their line of sight, especially nowadays when doctors generally work shifts. And even midwives work shifts now. I mean, you're coming back with this, this continuity of care model, which is really great. I forgot the word that they use for it. It's in the documentary Birth Time, but where the midwife stays with the woman the whole time, and she's on call for her.
Yeah, continuity.
Yeah, there's another word for it they use, but doesn't matter. I mean, that makes more sense because then that woman is invested in you. That midwife is invested in you. And it works both ways. As a physician, I was always invested in my clients because I got joy out of seeing the end work of the end product. Can you imagine? I can't imagine taking care of somebody in labor and they're starting to push, and now it's 7:00 in the morning and I'm leaving. I go home. And I never get to see the result of that birth. It's just because it's just a job. And these people are not within your line of sight. We rarely will take our emotions beyond our own line of sight. We care deeply about the people in our immediate circle, but we don't really care about the stranger. We just can't. I mean, we're not capable of having that kind of love and that kind of devotion to everyone around us. We can't possibly care that, or we would just tear what little hair we have left, we'd be tearing it out because the world is such a mess. But when your sister's in trouble, when your kid's in trouble, when your dad is sick, we care deeply about those sorts of things. And we'd like to have that same relationship with, not just our hairdresser. Okay, we'd like to have it with our birth keepers as well, and we used to, and it's been taken away by corporations and governments, and they've interspersed themselves between the woman and her caregiver. And anytime you put middlemen in the middle, nobody benefits. The middlemen benefit.
Yeah.
Right. So it used to be that we got paid for, we charged the patient something and they paid us. And then they created something called third-party payers. Insurance companies got smart and they figured out how can we capture revenue? And they make more money with taking no liability, working 9 to 5. Try calling your insurance company after 5:00. But you only get sick between 9 and 5. Don't you know that? You can't get sick at 2:00 in the morning. But you can still call your doctor. Well, used to be you called somebody and the person picking up the phone would know you. Now, generally, when you call, you get a stranger.
You actually get AI.
Or you get AI. Right.
You don't even get a person.
Which has no attachment to you whatsoever. And they're not gonna have the same affection for you and the caring about you as they would if they were somebody that you had continuity of care with. So, yeah, women need to take charge. And so back to your question, it's don't abdicate the responsibility to somebody else. Start young, learn about your body, and interview obstetricians or midwives before you're pregnant. Go in and have a visit with them. And remember, by the way, when you have that first visit with your obstetrician, even if you are early pregnancy, you're the consumer. You're interviewing them. They're not interviewing you. Don't let them take your blood pressure. Don't let them draw blood on you. Don't let them do anything to you that visit. You go in there and you ask them, how do you feel about a woman going past 40 weeks? What happens if my babies breech? Do you give Pitocin after every baby comes out? How do you feel about if I wanted to decline Group B strep screening or diabetes screening? Ask these questions. See how they feel. You'll know if you feel comfortable or not. It's really easy to see. If they're looking you in the eye and they're giving you an honest answer, that's a good person. If they're not looking you in the eye, if they're looking into their computer or they can't wait to get their foot out of the door, then don't go back. Don't shop there again. If somebody treated you like that at a restaurant, You wouldn't go back to that restaurant. Why do you keep going back to this person? Simply because they take your insurance? Don't do that. Don't do that anymore. Make it harder for them. And I was one of them. And I think that we as the consumers need to understand that I said at the very beginning, it's time to make them a little more uncomfortable. Make them stand up. They say something like, if you try to have a VBAC, the chance of you rupturing is 10%. Doctor, that really seems a little bit high to me. And since my husband's not here, can you give me the reference for that? So I'd like to go over that with my husband. See what they say.
Yeah.
Because
it's a good one.
Because they're making it up. Don't let them get away with that stuff. Don't let them say it's really risky. Can you define really risky, doctor? What does that mean? Really risky. Is it really risky to me? What is really risky? Is it 1 in 100? 1 in 1,000? What is really risky? And by the way, what's the risk of induction if you're going to induce me? You're telling me that if I don't induce me, that I'll have a bad outcome. But what's the outcome if you do induce me? What does that do to me? What does that do to my baby? What does that, artificially stuff? What's my chance of ending up with interventions and a C-section if you induce me because I'm a little itchy?
Oh my God!
Ask these questions. If you don't know what to ask, then you're going to get railroaded. What?
Yeah. No, I love this. And this is exactly what I mean by it's time that we do look in the mirror, because
just start asking the questions and educating ourselves and taking a little more charge of our care and that of our children. We are starting to run out of time, Dr. Stu, and I just wanted to really quickly end this on one other question. For those who are not watching, Dr. Stu is wearing a Wakefield Was Right t-shirt. So just for those, we actually get a lot of people asking about vaccines. So I thought I'd just quickly ask from a doctor, in your professional opinion, should we be vaccinating our children?
Well, let me start before that, because there's something called the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle makes sense, all right? Some principles don't make sense, but this one makes sense. And precautionary principle is that you don't use experimental substances on pregnant women and newborn babies. You just don't do it. And we violated that. We violated that for decades, but we really violated the last 3 years, okay? So that's the first thing. I would tell a pregnant woman, just so that you know, that none of the vaccines recommended in pregnancy by RANSCOG and by the American College of OBGYN as well, which include the flu, the COVID, the DTaP, which is 3 vaccines, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, and the RSV vaccine, which is given at 34 weeks. The other 5 are offered at 28 weeks. None of them have ever been tested for safety in anyone, let alone a pregnant woman, in a randomized placebo-controlled trial, all right? None of them have been tested for safety. Some of them contain heavy metals. We know they're toxic, and yet they recommend them anyway. So that should disqualify RANSCOG as being authoritative on anything when they're still recommending that. And I'm presuming that RANSCOG does, because I know ACOG still does.
They do. They were also, their discussions around the COVID vaccine very shortly after it came out were pretty crazy and hyperbolic. I was watching, and it was pretty full on.
And again, that should just tell you right then and there that they do not have your interest at heart, that they're supported by Big Pharma, and it's monetarily motivated, because they would have never told pregnant women to get any of these vaccines, let alone the COVID vaccine, while they're pregnant or they're breastfeeding. So no vaccines while you're pregnant, no vaccines for your newborn baby, and no vaccines ever. Okay? Until they prove that they're safe, because most of the diseases they're protecting you against are benign.
Mm-hmm.
Measles, mumps, chickenpox. Yeah. Can some rare cases cause severe problems? Yes, they can. But so can the vaccine. And if you look at I don't know what your reporting system is, but if you look at your reporting system, you'll see that the side effects of the vaccines are probably far worse than the disease itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do some babies die from pertussis? Yeah, they do. Okay. But ask yourself, look up the data, find out how many actually die. And you'll find that the death rate in children under 5 is like 1 out of every 16 to 20,000 babies who get RSV. So, I mean, yeah, or pertussis I'm talking about, not RSV, yep. Pertussis. So you'll see that there's hospitalizations and things like that happen. But also there's never a thought of what does that do to my immune system if I catch a disease and I get better? And how does that make me healthier and stronger for the rest of my life? And if I catch a disease and get better, I probably have lifelong immunity. If I get vaccinated against it, I probably will be immune for 6 months to a couple of years, and then I'll be susceptible to it. Or I could even catch it or spread that strain that I've gotten. We have measles outbreaks periodically in the United States, and they make a big deal out of there's a measles outbreak someplace. Turns out that it wasn't a measles outbreak. It was a kid who got vaccinated for the measles, and he got a rash from the vaccine, and the reporters pointed it out as a measles outbreak. And the strain that he got, that they broke out with, was the vaccine strain, not the wild strain. So this is what Andy Wakefield started to just ask questions about 20-some years ago, when he noticed that a lot of babies who were getting vaccinated, especially little black boys, were getting vaccinated with the MMR. Actually, it might have been the MMR at that time.
It was the MMR, yeah.
Measles, mumps, and rubella.
Yeah.
And they were developing intestinal problems from that. And by the way, a big part of our immune system, maybe up to 80% of our immune system, is based on our gut. And a lot of these little black boys, not only did they have intestinal problems, but they turned out to have autism as well. So he just wrote a paper explaining that there seems to be a link between these two. We need to do more investigation. And for that, the British Medical Association took away his medical license, and they took away, they retracted the paper and all that stuff. Turns out everything he said was true. And he's redeemed himself. I mean, he didn't have to redeem himself. He's reinvented himself now as a director, and he directed the film Vaxxed, and a new movie that came out this year called Protocol 7 about the mumps vaccine and about the fraudulent behavior of Merck, the company that put out the mumps vaccine. And so I would tell you that you would never take an experimental substance or a substance that's not deemed safe in your body voluntarily, orally, let alone having it injected into your body. When you take it orally, at least your gut and your liver have a chance to do something to it. But when you inject it in your body, it goes immediately into your bloodstream. And a lot of these things cross the blood-brain barrier. They don't stay where they're injection. They lie. They lie about everything. And once they've been caught lying about everything as they have done, then we need to say, why would I ever trust them again? So they've blown it, because maybe vaccines were beneficial. When I was a kid, I got 2. A tetanus shot and polio. That was it. I had all the other diseases. I caught them myself, and I got better, and I'm probably better off for it. Right? Now in my country, kids get, before the COVID vaccine, they were getting 72 vaccines in 18 years. And now it's probably 90. And there was at the 6-month visit, I think a baby gets 6 vaccines at one time. These things have never been tested for safety alone, let alone giving 6 at one time. And it doesn't take, you don't have to have research or studies. Like I said before, the red light, green light thing. To jab a newborn baby with hepatitis vaccine, which is a disease of sexually transmission, to a baby that can't possibly have it, it's got to be the dumbest one, and the HPV is probably the second dumbest one. So we need to rethink that if your trust in the medical system isn't well founded anymore. And I'm sorry to say that, because I'm part of that system. So.
Well, this has
not
been
anymore. I feel like not anymore.
Well,
part of our system.
New paradigm. New paradigm.
It's like, I'm still doctor. So,
Yes.
I'm not going to not call myself doctor.
No.
And they can't take that title away from me. They couldn't take it away from Andy Wakefield either.
Well, I feel like our babies are about to jump off the couches. We're at the max, aren't
watching
we?
you guys you're managing babies and all this stuff while carrying on a conversation. It's been fun for me to watch, actually.
So good. Well, it's been
mothers.
such this has been a great conversation, and I think it's been a long time coming, and
we so appreciate your insights and your ability to speak to the system, because you have worked it, you have lived it and breathed it, and you've come out, and hats off to you for jumping into the home birth scene, because how many, even like medical midwives, doctors, like obstetricians have actually ever seen a normal physiological birth?
I don't know. Doctors don't watch birth at the hospital. They're called to the room when there's something to do. The last thing I would like to just say is I'd like to give credit for everything that I've learned to the midwives that came before me and that taught me what I know. I've expanded on that, but I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't walk on the coattails of the midwives that were in my community who walked on the coattails of the midwives who came before them, and then the granny midwives who came before them. So, there's so much wisdom and knowledge there that has been dismissed because it can't be controlled by the medical industrial complex.
Yeah.
So just, to the women that are listening, take back control of your birthright.
Yeah.
As Rachel Reed likes to say, it's a rite of passage, and it really is.
Absolutely.
There's no greater thing that you can do.
Yeah.
And so don't abdicate it to somebody else.
And if any listeners out there, because we do have a lot of pregnant women and women in the birth space who like to tune in, I know that they can learn more from you and from Midwife Bliss on your podcast, Birthing Instincts, which we will link to in the show notes. Is there anywhere else people can reach you or find you?
Yeah, I mean, my website is birthinginstincts.com. And Instagram is Birthing Instinct. Everything is Birthing Instincts, actually. So, if you just Googled Birthing Instincts, everything would all my stuff would come up. But I'm not. I'm not doing this for commercial reasons. I do this because I love it. I do love the teaching part, and I teach these seminars, maybe 10 to 12 a year. And I was fortunate because I traveled through your country and I got to teach 6 seminars. And I got to speak at the Convergence of Rebellious Midwives Conference, which is one of the best titles of a conference I've ever been to. And then I got to be on with Rhea Dempsey. I don't know if you guys know who Rhea is, but
yeah,
we've had her on a few times.
She had me on one of her live conversations with her, and I got to do a master class in Melbourne, where actually an OB that I've met before named Ravi attended, and he's a unique soul too, because there aren't very many OBs that ever come and want to learn this sort of thing. So anyway, guys, I got to go, and I know that your boobs are probably exploding, so we'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, guys. See you later.
Thanks for tuning in to the Road to Wisdom podcast. To join the journey, you can follow us on Instagram at theroadtowisdom.podcast and at www.theroadtowisdompodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We look forward to seeing you next week with more juicy content.